Hey folks, welcome back to the show. The new name of the show, you may have noticed, is Longevity with Natalie Needham. So Biohacking Superhuman Performance is our old name. Longevity is the new name. Other than that, nothing has changed about this podcast. The focus, the topics, the guests, everything's going to stay the same. It's just a new name, a little bit easier to remember maybe, and it really speaks to what we want to talk about in this show. It could be biohacking, it could be medicine, it could be natural methods, it could be a million different things. But really the reason why I wanted to rebrand and rename this podcast was really to bring to light that what we're really talking about here is longevity. So everything else stays the same. If you want to connect with me or sign up for my newsletter, anything like that, definitely go to natnidham.com. And also on Instagram, you could find me at Natalie Needham, Nathalie, and then Niddam. All right, now let's talk about our episode. How much do you think your mindset, emotions, and life experiences impact your physical health and immune function? A lot, right? And it does that in ways that are often overlooked by conventional medicine. And we know this. So we are deep diving right into this topic with my guest today, who is quite apart from being redonkulously smart. She is an amazing physician. She's an amazing person. We first met about a year and a half ago, and I've always known that this is someone I really want to feature on this podcast. Her name is Dr. Olivia Lesslar, and she joins us to discuss the field of psychoneuroimmunology, otherwise known as PNI, and its impact on health and well-being. It's not as scary as it sounds, trust me. She explains the complexity of PNI and how everything in the body is ultimately interconnected. Dr. Lesslar emphasizes the power of belief and mindset in influencing health outcomes and highlights the importance of addressing emotions and attitudes in patient care. So she's speaking to you, the patient, but she's also speaking to you if you happen to be a physician listening to this podcast. We talk about the role of compassion in medicine, how important it is to treat the whole person. I mean, we talk about the subjectivity of pain. We talk about nocebo effect. It's a really great conversation, and you will get so many amazing takeaways from this, whether you yourself are dealing with illness or someone in your life is dealing with illness, or like I said, if you happen to be a physician, you are treating patients yourself. Now, Dr. Olivia works with innovative clinics and organizations worldwide. Her coordinating clinic is Singulum Health, which is a neuro center founded by renowned neurosurgeon, Professor Charles Teo. And anyway, she's just, I encourage you not only to listen to this episode, but you've got to check out the show notes just for her full bio. So to find more on Olivia Lesslar, you can go to her website, which is Dr. Olivia Lesslar, Lesslar.com. You can follow her on Instagram. Once again, Dr. Olivia Lesslar, and on Facebook, Dr. for Dr. Olivia Lesslar. So she kept it simple for us. And now let's jump into the episode. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider. Dr. Olivia Lesslar, welcome to the show. It is a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nat. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, this is our second conversation for the podcast. The first one we recorded in person at A4M, and it was awesome, except for the part that my microphones didn't work.
So, we've rehearsed this, right? So we should be shit hot. It's great.
Exactly. And so the reason why we're having this conversation is because we met at an event called Dragonfly in November in Colorado, and I heard your 10-minute talk. And then I got to hang out with you, and I'm like, holy cow, the world needs to hear about this.
Oh, no, thank you.
Well, I mean, I love what you're talking about. I love that your chosen profession as you're moving into it. And I'm going to have you explain to the audience a little bit about how you went from going to med school, becoming a medical doctor, and now being the person who's heading up the charge really in many ways on PNI, which is Psychoneuroimmunology, which is really big words, guys, but don't run away. Like, it's actually not nearly as scary as it sounds. And you've probably heard about it in some way, shape, or form already.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, originally back in the sort of 70s, when they first started talking about these intersection points between psychology, the P, the nervous system, the immune system, and hormones, it was actually called PENI or PNEI. The only problem is, I don't know if I told you this the last time, when you're a psycho-endo-neuro-immunology specialist, that's not the best acronym. So
it's a bit tough.
Yeah. So we try to stay away from the PENIS and we're just PNI.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. I was a little slow on that one. Okay.
So, but it's actually not just PNI. It is the fact that everything is connected to everything. And biohackers know this. Conventional doctors actually know this to a certain extent, but we are only just finally starting to really come together as professionals to talk about these intersection points. So as much as I do talk about psychoneuroimmunology, the psycho component does actually have behavioral sciences embedded into it. Hormones are part of it, physiology too. So it's a very, very complex sort of a subspecialty almost, if you will. And it's very exciting because you will probably never get on top of it all. There's just so much new stuff coming through all the time.
Yeah, well, it's funny, and it's interesting that you use the word complex versus complicated, right? So complex implying that what it is it's all interconnected.
Yes.
And it's really, I don't think it's really as simple as saying, well, where does it begin? Does it begin in the nervous system? Does it begin in the gut? Does it begin with the pain, and that affects the nervous system, which then affects this, that, or the other thing? It's this integrated whole that responds as an organism, really, like as a whole piece, and everything's interconnected. So how much, okay, so let's talk about, you went to med school. There's no freaking way anybody taught you about this in med school.
Nope, zero, none. We did hear about the placebo effect, right?
Which is part of this, right?
Which is part of this, yeah. And the nocebo effect. I mean, the very fact that just thinking something can spark the neuropharmacology that actually makes the chemicals that then, presents as physiological changes. So we were taught about that, but we were basically told to kind of ignore it. So you got to push past the placebo. Yeah, you got to push past the placebo and nocebo.
Which is a bit shocking, right? Because if you think about it, what it should engender is a huge amount of curiosity.
Oh, yes.
Right? Like, isn't there a case of a guy that died because he was told he was going to die, only it turns out there was nothing wrong with him at all in the first place?
Yeah.
I totally butchered that story. Would you like to share the proper story?
But that's actually, I heard this from a integrative oncologist, Dr. Tony Jimenez. And he shares this story about this man who was diagnosed with a terminal cancer. He had 6 months to live. He dropped dead pretty much 6 months on the dot, with an autopsy to show, whoopsies, it was actually a false positive. Now we hear about the nocebo effects, and nocebo meaning that if you feel that something is going to cause you harm, it will. We hear about that all the time. In fact, I've just come across the work of Alia Crum, and she is a psychology professor at Yale, I believe. The first time I ever came across her work was when I was working with a allergist immunologist in Australia. And this particular study, which was handed to me, was about the fact that in patients who have severe allergy to peanuts, if they believe that there is peanut powder in a particular substance, they will have wheals, hives, bronchoconstriction, and go into an anaphylactoid state because they believe that the peanut powder is in there, even though it's not. And as I delved further into Alia's work, she does a lot of this kind of work. She's got another one called Mindset Over Milkshake. And this particular paper is about the fact that if you have a, let's just say, 800 calorie milkshake, but you tell one group of patients that it is a 2,000 calorie milkshake, and you tell another group of patients that it's a 100 calorie milkshake, the patients actually, their ghrelin, so their satiety hormones, actually change according to what they think. So it's not about the fat and sugar binding onto receptors and initiating physiological changes, biochemical changes. It's about what you think is going to happen, and that will happen.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's crazy. Like the stories we tell ourselves, right? I'm insulin resistant.
Yeah.
I can't handle carbs.
Yeah.
Fat's going to kill me.
Yes. Yes, exactly. I mean, orthorexia, so in my own practice, I'm very lucky. I have been one after another. I have been exposed to patients who have got the most amazing lessons to teach me, index patients, right? And I have seen patients do very well, even though they don't change their rubbish diet, because they change how they approach their food, how they approach mealtime. They go into a parasympathetic state. They give thanks for their food or whatever it may be. And I have seen plenty of patients, and we all know them because they're called orthorexic, right?
Yeah.
Where they eat the perfect food. It's organic. It's, well prepared. There's no seed oils, blah, 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 blah. But they still don't do well. And part of it has got to do with their attitudes around the food. There's that lack of gratitude. There's that over anxiety. There's that anticipatory anxiety. All these things which we kind of constantly ignore in favor of hard sciences. How many proteins and what kind of proteins? Are there seed oils? Is it oxidized oils? All these sorts of things we can have more control over, more quantifiable, qualifiable data. We ignore the spirit. We ignore the emotions.
Yeah. And, it's so interesting you say this because, lately I've kind of been slightly obsessed with centenarians because if we look at the centenarians that are around us today, I challenge anyone to find a biohacker in there.
Exactly.
I challenge anyone, no, but seriously, anyone to find that. And as a matter of fact, some of these people are people who survived horrible life experiences.
Yep.
Right? They are, in some cases, they're Holocaust survivors, or they're people who lived through incredible stress during the Second World War, and like people who really had a tough life.
Yeah.
Like they it was not sunshine and roses. They didn't have the luxury of worrying what their macros were or whether there was seed oil in their food. And frankly, if you talk to most of them, they still don't give a flying fajita about most of it. Right? For the most part, there's a big chunk of community in there, that social support networks. There's somewhat of obliviousness to this whole conversation that we tend to obsess over food about. And yet here they are now. I guess some people might say, yes, but they're frail. They're not particularly, they don't look great. They're not moving well, this whole 9 yards. And that may all be true. And maybe if we could find a middle line between, improving certain things and not getting so hung up on everything, that we might be a better centenarian than the centenarian that is, the current centenarian.
It's almost as if we have a bit of a, we're anxietyists. Some anxieties are better than other anxieties, right? So if you're anxious about, or you're being very particular about whether something is organic, about the source of your water, about which shilajit you're using that's better than another, this is apparently better anxiety than if you're being anxious about, losing your car keys and fighting with your boss. And I just
anxiety snobs.
Anxiety snobs. So, there's something to be said about letting go, because I know in my life, when I have been through periods of time where I have tried harder to lean into issues rather than to fight what's happening, a little bit of surrender goes a long way. I do feel more in flow.
Yeah.
Of course, that's just my experience.
For sure. And I think there's going to be middle ground in all of these things, right? But at the same time, it's interesting when you were talking about the nocebo effect a minute ago, and a word that you don't hear very often anymore, but I'm sure that it still is used. And is relevant is hypochondriacs,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So, because I think the hypochondriac of before is the person who is experiencing the nocebo effect
Oh, yeah.
of today, right?
Yeah.
We've repackaged and redefined hypochondriacs. Hypochondriacs notoriously are told it's all in your head. There's nothing wrong with you. And again, there's a fine line between being gaslit by a physician who refuses to acknowledge that, what they're seeing on the paper and what is presenting in front of them are not matching.
Yeah.
And so they're going by the numbers and they're saying, no, numbers look good. You're fine.
Yeah.
Right. Which is like the dreaded 4-letter word.
Yeah.
And at the same time, a person who on paper doesn't physically seem to have anything wrong with them and yet is a bit of a train wreck.
Yeah.
And so how do you think we come to a resolution here? How do we meet in the middle on this stuff? How do we separate those things?
Oh, okay. Look,
It's a tough one, right?
Yeah, really. From a physician's point of view, we get told this in medical school in conventional settings, and that is pain is what the patient says it is. Full stop, end of story. Because
Okay.
pain is so subjective and it changes from culture to culture. I saw this when I was working in OBGYN in Australia, where there's a particular culture. Well, actually, it was the Kiwis, the New Zealanders that were in Australia. It didn't matter what race they were from New Zealand. They did seem to have a higher pain tolerance compared
That's because they do the haka.
maybe, maybe. Getting
They're
rid of all the
tough.
bad juju, right? But compared to the Australian women, and it didn't matter what cultural background, it just seems as if the Australian women had a lower pain threshold. So pain is subjective, and we were told by our professors that pain is what the patient says it is. Now, at some point, this gets lost because, we do, back in the day, in hospital, you roll your eyes a lot with regards to patients coming in saying this, that, and the other, and there's nothing objectively to be found. But we now know so much more about pain, peripheral mechanisms, central mechanisms of pain, the number of receptors that are involved is mind-boggling. I mean, you have whole PhDs just talking about pain. So first of all, for a doctor to see that a patient is struggling in front of them, but the numbers say they're okay, is already missing a trick if they tell the patient that they're fine and to go home, because clearly something is wrong. We do standard blood tests, which would be 30, 20 something biomarkers. How many biomarkers do you think there actually are in the body? Thousands.
Yeah.
Right?
Countless.
Right.
Yeah.
Countless. So, that's the first thing. Second is that when you leave patients in limbo, when they are not heard, and there is a really good study about this actually, where, let me try and remember this one properly. Essentially, doctors who were held to high esteem by their colleagues and by patients were interviewed to ask, what is it about what you do or how you do your work means that patients respond better and your colleagues say that you are one of the best? And all of them, it boiled down to compassion. Compassion. When did we lose that as a profession? So to dismiss a patient outright, even though the patient is clearly at least psychically hurt, and to not give them at least some sort of either reassurance or just to listen to them, means that you are causing more harm. And we are told first, do no harm, right? So I think the onus actually does sit a lot with the doctors. I mean, I've been very lucky, as I said, in my own practice. I have a lot of index patients who have taught me things. And one of the lessons that I have been taught over and over and over again is that patients, if you give them the time of day, if you listen to them, the answer is to be found.
Yeah. I've heard this repeatedly from people from physicians on this podcast, the ones that, they tend to be the ones that do the 2-hour intake the first time around. I interviewed one woman, Amy Jaramillo, a couple of years ago, who helps people with ALS. She literally, and has some success, a degree of success with some of these intractable conditions. And she said she takes 2 hours for that intake. And sometimes when she gets stuck, she'll go back to her notes. And she said, you know what? It's almost always in there. Something
Yeah.
is almost always in there that you missed, like an event,
Yeah.
a moment an inflection in time where things changed.
Yeah. Yeah. And doctors are always looking for that exposure to a chemical, or that time when you moved right next door to a nuclear power plant, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But actually, when you go past that and you are also looking at emotional events, spiritual events, those can be very insightful too, because PNI tells us, and it's encoded in the literature, that emotional and psychic grievances, or stored guilt, shame, grief, fear, these things can and do change immunology. They do affect your physiology, and you can suffer the consequences of that changed physiology, also known as symptoms or disease. So if you're also looking for those things in the history, it's there.
Yeah. And so what do we do with this? Like, what do we, as coaches, as parents, as citizens of the world, and as doctors, what do people do with this information? Like, I wonder, I mean, I guess the step, the obvious step, which is much easier said than done, is don't let your crap accumulate and lock it up in a box. I mean, to be highly scientific about it.
Emotional autophagy.
Yeah, exactly. Emotional autophagy. We need to clean it out. Never mind senescent cells, senescent emotions, right?
Senescent emotions, right? Look, I think it's the fact that for ages, especially non-conventional health practitioners have been talking about treating the person as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
But we really need to understand what that means and truly embrace that. Treating the person as a whole means that you are also looking at their emotional health. And you are spending as much time with that as everything else. Because the whole point of PNI is that it opens up the more and more dominoes to be able to tip over. So you can affect your immunology by modulating your nervous system. You can affect your nervous system by modulating your behavior. You can modulate your behavior by your psychology. You can change your psychology by making sure that your hormones are optimized, and so on. And you can approach the entire system through any one of these dominoes. There is
Interesting.
chicken and egg necessarily, right?
Yeah.
That's why people are always looking for the next silver bullet, the next peptide, the next drug injection, intervention. And don't get me wrong, I love my toys like the next person.
Yeah.
But with our patients, especially the complex, chronic, unwell patients where they've got mystery illnesses in inverted commas or cancer, it is our duty to make sure that they have all the information with regards to all the tools that could possibly be used to move the needle, and not keep them in this state of FOMO where they feel they have to be buying the red light panel and the hyperbaric chamber and the IV nutrients. Because, getting those basics right, and it's not just sleep and movement and mind, there's so much more to it. How you breathe. Thank goodness for people like, McEwen, right? How you
Patrick
breathe.
McEwen, Daniel Nestor. Yeah.
James Nestor. Exactly. It makes such a difference. How you
Yeah.
breathe.
Yeah.
Your posture can make a huge difference. So all these little things, I just say to patients, look, we're going to try and leverage everything that we can, especially all the free stuff in the beginning, because even if each of those things moves the needle by 0.5%, you stack enough of them, you've moved the needle 5%. That's a lot. And that was free, right? And then you can start trying to chase the big things, but even FOMO as a state of being, I feel it can be very detrimental for patients, where they're like, oh, I can't afford to do this and do that, and therefore I'm not going to get better, not like that person who could afford all those things.
Right. Like I can't get the latest stem cell treatment and therefore I'm cooked.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's, it's so interesting, this whole conversation, because I think that for every one of those people who had access to all of that cutting edge technology, you will find people out there who achieved incredible things without it.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I guess like what's the question is, how do we help people to navigate this without leaving them feeling like, I don't know how to really articulate this, but in a way, without leaving them with the burden of getting better by themselves? Because
Yeah.
in a way, what we're saying, we're not exactly saying it's in your head, but we're kind of saying it's up to you. Like you are in control here. Um, and we don't want people to feel that what we're saying is, well, if you could just get your act together,
Yeah.
you'd be fine.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And I cleaned up that statement.
Yeah.
You know me well enough to know.
Yeah. Right.
Right?
It's
And so, because that doesn't honor the individual, it doesn't honor the experience, that their lived experience, what they are going through. And so I guess the question is and I love that you mentioned the hormones before and even the microbiome, because the other area I think where this is a very real thing is in the mental health crisis that
oh yeah.
we're in the middle of right now.
Oh yeah.
You literally can't turn around. I would challenge anyone to say that there's nobody in their family, like their immediate family, that doesn't suffer from some kind of mental health difficulties
Yeah.
right now.
Absolutely.
And again, I think in this area, it's very hard, because you try to help someone, very often the reaction is, well, you're not honoring their experience, or you're victim shaming them, or like, how do we navigate that and still, like, man,
Yeah.
it's like walking through a
It
minefield.
is. Look, and that's why the every patient is unique, right? How you frame a message changes from patient to patient. Now that's true individualization. That's true personalization of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, the one thing that I do say with all patients, and it really doesn't matter what disease they come with, what religion or culture they are from, I see symptoms, I see disease states as the body's attempt to adapt to whatever pressures it is undergoing. So that's a universality for all of
Yeah.
us, right? Because I think this is attributed to Darwin, but it's not actually, it was a paraphrase. But essentially, it's not about the fittest of the species that survives. It's actually that animal that can adapt.
The most resilient. Yeah.
Yes, right. And so this adaptability of the system gives us a clue as to what it thinks the pressures are. Because the one thing that I have come to see in my research is that it is not necessary, kind of like that Alia Crum story with the peanuts, right? Or with the milkshake. You don't actually have to have the pathogen or the molecule that's going to bind onto a receptor in the system. Your body just has to think that it's coming, and it will already start trying to protect you. So if we pay homage to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and understand that the base driver for the animal, in this case us, the human, is to survive at the expense of optimized fitness, so survival, then you can start to see why the system is throwing out certain outputs in response to perceived inputs. There is a professor in London called Carl Friston who came up with the free energy principle. He will probably win the Nobel Prize for it. And essentially, it is about the fact that the brain is constantly calculating and adapting to perceived inputs to decrease surprise and increase outputs without that lag in hesitation that comes from not enough calculation. So his theory can be applied to, like, that's why practicing at softball makes you a better player, because every time you hit that ball, there's something different about the environment. Your posture, the speed of the ball, the twist of the ball, the temperature of the, what you were wearing, all like the permutations are endless.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, at every point of a exposure, your brain is tagging. And so it collates all this vast amounts of information, because at some point in the future, it's going to be able to take from here, and give the immediate output that you need for that particular constellation of factors. And that happens all the time for everything. So
Interesting.
I had this patient that I was talking about, this index patient. I talked about a dragonfly. So she was a 60-something-year-old female who came in. She had been referred to me by her immunologist because she had severe food intolerances, and the amounts of foods that she could tolerate was going down. She was down to boiled chicken, boiled potatoes, boiled peas. That's it. Like sometimes
Yikes.
when it was really bad, she would get angioedema. She would get swelling of the lips and like hives just from water. Right? That's called aquagenic urticaria.
Wow.
And he didn't know what to do with her. And so he sent her to me because obviously that's all I'm good for. He was like, can you give her IV nutrients, please? So
Do something.
do something.
Make it stop.
Right. So, like all good physicians, what do? You listen to the patient. You talk to them. And we had a good, nice, long chat. But in that talk, I realized that she had quite a few mercury fillings. She had quite a few amalgams. So I said, look, why don't we at least take that off the table, right? Because you've got osteoporosis now. More than likely, the density of your teeth has also suffered, which means that there's a chance that the mercury might be leaking. This is where it starts. She said no. She did not want to remove the mercury. And the next question is an important one, as opposed to, oh, okay, it's why not? Because I knew she could afford it, so why not? And she wound up saying to me about childhood and the fact that her father had abused her in her mouth. And so she didn't want anyone coming near her mouth and doing any sort of instrumentation. Eventually, we worked out a deal where I found her a very compassionate, lovely, small dentist who was very gentle with her. They wound up taking out all 4 amalgams in 2 settings, played her favorite music. Her daughter was allowed to stand there, hold her hand, all that kind of stuff. She came to see me 6 weeks later, and she walked in and she said, I'm not actually here for a consult. I just want you to guess where I'm going now. That's literally what she said to me. I said, okay, I don't know. What are you talking about? And she said, I'm off to a food fair with my friends.
Oh, what a food fair.
Yeah. Right.
Wow.
So about 4 to 5 weeks, and she could eat anything. And that's how I went back to the drawing board with the immunologist to try and figure this out. And it was that her mouth, the threat detection systems were already all on high alert. The nervous system was on edge, and therefore the immune system was on edge because the nervous system was on edge. All the threat detection systems were upregulated. And when her teeth did start leaking the mercury, because 2 of her 4 amalgams were leaking,
for sure,
it was tripping the threat detection systems. And so the nervous system, it doesn't know, wait, hang on, what's going on? There's a threat. It starts tagging everything. Maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's that, maybe it's this. And then before you know it, the system is so nervous, so twitchy, it's tagged almost everything. And the minute we pulled away from, tripping the system, everything kind of calmed down again. And that is the work that I do with transient receptor potential ion channels, which is what I tend to publish on. And that is this network, this system of ion channels, which are calcium gated mostly, evolutionarily conserved all the way down to nematode worms. And they help the brain take in information from the outside world and the inside world so that the brain can calculate threat. And it's actually, a lot of it is subjective. So there is a TRIP, transient receptor potential ion channel. There is a TRIP, for example, that will help perceive cold. And for the average person, when your TRPM8 goes off, oh my gosh, it's very cold. Pain, when you're drinking cold water, it's pain in your mouth or whatever. But someone like Wim Hof has recalibrated or changed the activation threshold of his TRPM8 so that he can climb to base camp in shorts and a t-shirt and he's fine because it's not setting off those alarm bells to say threat, 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 threat. So these things can change over time. They're very dynamic. And in fact, the dynamism in the system is a lot more robust than we realize as well.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because with all these people cold plunging right, left, and center, it's, and there's this big pushback. A lot of people are saying it's too much. It's too much for the nervous system. It's too much for this person. It's too much for that person. And I think that what's interesting about that, as you bring up the Wim Hof concept, is that, and even everything that you're talking about, is that the people who are able to cold plunge and overcome the fear, which because it's innate, right? Your body is pretty darn sure you're trying to kill it at this point.
Exactly.
Your primitive brain's like, seriously, it's come to this.
Yeah. Right.
And what we're being coached into doing is convincing the body that, you know what, it's okay, you're safe. And some of the best coaches I've seen who are putting people in the ice speak about security.
Yes.
They're talking about safety. They're not talking about fight the cold.
Yes.
It's about you're safe, you're okay, you're going to be fine, and resetting those. And I guess that's physiologically what it's doing, is resetting those receptors.
Exactly. It is changing that activation threshold of some of these receptors. Absolutely. Right.
But then but then that translates into the other, but then the pitch on the cold exposure, deliberate cold exposure, is that it should translate into other areas of life.
So these trips, the ones I'm talking about, for example, and mind you, these are not the only threat detection systems. So, So my, so a medical hypothesis that I'm currently working on, which is huge, it's called it's a threat detection network. And a threat detection network is how all the different threat detection systems actually speak to each other at a quantum level, like it happens instantaneously, because redundancies are built into the system so that your nervous system, so that evolution never misses a trick. So you've got the transient receptor potential ion channels, and these ones tend to actually be very promiscuous. And what I mean by that is that, TRPV1 will not just do temperature, but it will also do pH, it will do chemical sensation, and so on and so forth. So that if TRPV1 is activated and your brain knows that it's been activated, it needs to correlate that sensation. Is it pH? Is it temperature? Is it chemical? With other threat detection systems. Hey guys, what are you seeing over there? What are you seeing?
Yeah.
Right?
The cross-referencing.
Cross-referencing, exactly. So you've got, your autonomic nervous system, you've got your HHPA axis, you've got your advanced glycation end products, you've got your microbiome systems. Again, this is, it's huge. You've got the transient receptor potential ion channels. You've got your attachment style due to how you were brought up. It takes into account the adverse childhood experiences or events. All these things come together to form this incredible web that informs your, responses to perceived threat. That's why we're so individual, right? And what fascinates me the most is not patients who fall within a bell curve. That's boring. It's the patients who are in the tail end of those bell curves, because that's where you're going to learn the most about, all these weird and wonderful things. So some of these threat detection systems are not as overt in some patients compared to others, right? And that's culturally informed, that's genetically informed, that's epigenetically informed. I've been working at this now for 2-3 years, and I still feel I'm just in the beginning, wading through this mountain of information. And every time I dive into the literature, I'm surprised at how much I didn't know.
We always, but it's interesting going back to your index patient about all of the different things that happened in that moment that allowed her system to calm down, right? Because there's the physical removal of the mercury, which I think nobody would argue
Yep.
is a problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem on a whole bunch of different levels, right?
Yeah.
There's her overcoming and resolving somehow this trauma that she carried with her whole life.
Yep. Because she was able to take control, right?
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
she was able to, because of you and the people that you found and her daughter and the willingness to create a safe space for her, able to work through that childhood trauma and get past it. Like, I don't think that if you had knocked her out unconscious and I wonder.
Oh, Nat, you've hit the nail on the head. 100%. Absolutely. She had a positive, negative experience with her mouth. There was patient autonomy. There was patient information. There was all these things, exactly as you said. You're absolutely right. I believe this as well. If she had been knocked out, it wouldn't have nearly had the kind of impact that it did.
Yeah. Like, I mean, you would have had a bit of a physical impact, probably like an improvement to some degree of her health.
Yeah.
But she may not have been able to like walk into your office 6 weeks later, literally, like the way you describe her and the way you described her back in November, you could see even in the way you were talking, like she was a new woman.
Oh yeah.
She had different energy. She was lit from within. Like she's a different person.
Yeah. Yeah. Because these are not, this isn't an IgE driven food allergy, right? These are IgG maybe. But in other words, her immune system, yes, it's upset right now, but it's not encoded in the DNA that it cannot handle these foods. So what's the intermediary? What's actually happened? Which is why she was able to turn it around because of all these different things. Yeah.
That's interesting that you say that. So, because that does, I mean, that, it's funny. I recorded not a similar, but another podcast in this kind of space recently. And the question is, so if somebody has an IgE allergy, would they be able to overcome that in this, with their mind or with their attitude or with their dealing with emotions? And that's where I'm always wondering, like, where's that edge where the physiology is going to say, actually, no, I don't actually care if you can take care of that crap.
Well, now
we have a problem.
Actually, now we have immunotherapies for some IgE-driven allergies, right? Like peanut, for example. And part of it is actually holding the nervous system and the immune system. You give them tiny amounts in a controlled space of whatever it is that they're allergic to, right? And then when the nervous system is about to react, it's kind of, maybe it's not that bad, right? So we're massaging the nervous and immune system a little bit, essentially also giving them these safety signals. So even though it sounds a lot as if it's just emotional or it's just, it all affects everything else, right? Because being in a less stressed state, what are the chemicals in your body? It's less cortisol, it's less adrenaline, it's less noradrenaline, right? So everything affects everything.
So in the immunotherapy, it must be really important, the messaging.
I think
and
so.
the emotions, right? Because if let's say you have a small child and you have a parent that's completely strung out at the concept of this, I would imagine that would affect the success.
Absolutely. And when you speak to immunologists about that, they will tell you that is the case. Children who have parents who are more stressed and anxious about the allergies, obviously this is life or death.
It's serious. You got to take this seriously.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
How a patient's parent handles the stress absolutely changes how often they get flares, or how bad those flares are, or how well they respond to immunotherapy. Yeah, absolutely. Patients who are empowered, even children who are empowered, where the parent is there and allows the child to ask the questions at the restaurant, for example, as opposed to taking control, the child doesn't have any autonomy,
Yeah,
those
no
patients,
voice.
Those patients do better as well when they are allowed to take control a little bit of their health. So there are all these nuances, I mean, allergy is a interesting area of medicine that actually is very new, considering, right? Allergy as a subspecialty has actually only been around for maybe about 40, 50 years or so, because before that it was considered rubbish because there weren't that many people who were allergic.
Well, I was going to ask you, don't you think we have way more allergy issues to deal with now than we
Absolutely.
did than our centenarians, for example, might have dealt with in their childhood?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I love the fact that I've spoken to several gastros about this. So late last year, I was in Copenhagen for the United European Gastroenterology Week, which, I mean, it was like basically digging my eyeballs out with a spoon, right?
Yeah.
And
I was sitting here thinking, that sounds super fascinating-ish.
it would have been, except all they did was talk about drugs. There was no
Depression.
talk. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. And in fact, there was a panel that basically laughed at a doctor who asked about lifestyle changes. And they said, lifestyle changes are too hard. Patients never do it. Drugs are safe. Drugs are easier. That was basically the messaging that was given out.
Wow.
And,
Wow.
don't get me started on the fact that, doctors are now jumping straight for reflux, jumping straight to things like PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, because we no longer have the H2 blockers like ranitidine that's been taken off the market. But heaven forbid you talk to patients about the fact that if they eat in a parasympathetic state, they're less likely to have reflux. If they go for a short walk after food, they're less likely to have reflux. All these things, nope, straight to the PPIs. And what we do, when we reach straight for our prescription pad, is that we rob the patients of information and autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
They don't
Mm-hmm.
believe that they can do anything to help themselves because we've basically said, you've come in with a problem. Don't you worry. I have the solution.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think both are true, right? I do on the PPI front. What's interesting about on reflux in particular, heartburn and reflux in particular. I mean, this is an interesting problem I find because it is, for the most part, solvable. This is a solvable problem. If
Yes.
you lay off the booze, if you get into a parasympathetic state, if you chew your food, if you maybe replace a few digestive enzymes if you need them, maybe up your zinc, hydrate, like all the things that we know, this is a solvable problem. Get off the caffeine, stop drinking booze, like all the things.
Yeah.
And so I personally have friends who have reflux and they've gone so far as not only are they taking the PPIs as a lifelong solution, and I'm sitting there going, but your bones are going to melt, right? Like you do realize that you're going to have a heart attack at some point. Like you do realize there's going to be a price to pay for anyway. But they've gone so far as to get a bed that keeps them sitting up at night. Yeah. So that, and they're like, oh, as long, I mean, Matt, like, you don't understand. Like, we got this. This is solved. And I'm like, and I've now learned, right? It's taken me a while to just say, okay.
Yeah. That's it. That really.
I love you. You're my friend. And if you ever want to have this conversation again, I'm here for you. Because I would go in all guns blazing, right? And I mean, like, you can do this and you can do this. And then there's BPC and there's all these things. And, and their eyes kind of glaze over. I just kind of go, okay, no.
And that's why I love evolutionary medicine. I love talking to patients about, let's assume for a second that whatever symptom you're having, in this case, reflux, let's assume that your body is doing it for a reason. So what does gastric acid do? How does it historically, evolutionarily help us? Oh, it's antimicrobial. Oh, it helps break down protein fibers. Oh, it helps to absorb iron. Oh, you have all these things. And then what if you don't have the acid then? Are you not going to have that antimicrobial effect? Do you get more indigestion because your meat, for example, the protein fibers are sitting there not being able to be broken down in the appropriate period of time? And if that is the case, what do you think your body is going to do in response? Oh, we have that protein just sort of kind of sitting there, but it's going to produce more acid because it's trying to help you. And, the reason why we keep talking about eating in a parasympathetic state is because in a sympathetic state, your body sometimes actually produces acid, gastric acid, because it's trying to head off at the pass a pathogen that may be coming in through your gastrointestinal tract, maybe coming through your mouth.
Oh, as a defense mechanism,
As a defense mechanism.
because I've always thought of it as digestion. Not necessary right now.
Not
We need
necessarily.
all hands on deck to get the hell away
Exactly.
from the lion.
That's
So,
right. That's right. Because
yeah.
because innate responses, so the first response to a perceived threat or a threat is that all your body knows is, okay, your cortisol is up, your adrenaline is up, and you're pacing, your eyes are darting backwards and forwards, you're hypervigilant for some reason, something's wrong. Now, it doesn't have the time to figure out, is it a famine? Is it a saber-toothed tiger? Is it COVID 26?
Yeah.
It will just go bam. And the interesting thing about the nervous system, kind of a little bit like that's demonstrated in fibromyalgia, which is also known as a pain memory syndrome, is that your body is like a house. If someone breaks into your house through the downstairs second bedroom window, the first place that you put bars up is going to be that window. So when your body then thinks, oh my gosh, there is something very wrong, all hands on deck, let's go, it will actually start protecting all the areas where you have previously already been breached in some way, shape, or form. That's why people have got tendencies for it to be their skin, or thrush in the vagina, or itchy eyes, or something like that, because your immune system has seen this before come through those particular guardian sites. Guardian site is a very important concept, actually. So a guardian site is a part of the body where if there was going to be a breach by something, virus, parasite, bacteria, so on and so forth, it would usually come through eyes, nose, respiratory system, mouth, gastrointestinal tract, vagina, to a lesser extent, our bladder system and the urethra, and our skin, especially that which is exposed the most, which is hands, palms, and soles of the feet. These areas have got a very different immune cohort that live there. More mast cells, for example. Hence why now mast cell activation is all out of control, because
Right. Well, they're points of entry into the body, basically.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I do talk about the fact that, well, for patients who are extremely twitchy, their nervous system is extremely twitchy, their immune systems are extremely twitchy, it can be very confusing for the immune system where you get a respiratory virus or parts of a respiratory virus drop straight into your deltoid, intramuscular, like a vaccine, for example, out of nowhere. That's very weird. You have a respiratory virus that I didn't see it in my respiratory system at all. Boom, in the muscle.
What's it doing there?
Yeah, right? So, and that's why a lot of these things tend, you can talk about it from a conventional perspective in that, the majority of people do okay with whatever intervention you're talking about. These medications, these vaccines, this whatever. And there's always a small, tiny, if you want to call it that, group of people who don't do so well. But we would do well to learn from them, right? To study why that is the case, as opposed to sweeping them under the carpet and, closing the door on that.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, there's so many of those groups of people. I mean, all these parents who believe that their children are vaccine injured, that whole autism discussion where, I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but I do believe that where there's smoke, there's fire. And I've always wondered why the conversation isn't really focused on, okay, is there a common thread running through these kids that doesn't run through the other kids whose systems, for whatever reason, are able to manage?
Right. Exactly. You brought this up in the beginning of our conversation, and that's about curiosity. Curiosity. So, look, this is quagmire basically, and we're probably not going to go down this road. But all patients deserve to be held. All patients deserve to be heard, and we are all not cookie cutted. In other words, we are all actually quite different, considering the myriad of experiences, both emotional, physical, immunological, that we have, that forms part of this beautiful kind of patchwork quilt. Right. And putting different elements together, these different permutations, means that you're not quite entirely sure how someone is going to react to, a new experience. So we should be open-minded enough to ask questions.
I love it. Okay. So as we're getting close to that time when you're going to be done with this conversation, I want to leave the audience with something, right? With some kind of I don't know if I want to call it a roadmap, but some kind of guidelines to help people navigate their own situation and in finding that practitioner who's going to walk that journey with them. Because I do think that, especially in complex diseases or complex conditions, then we don't even need to call them diseases, like these complex situations where you mentioned mast cell activation syndrome, people who seem to be allergic to the air.
Yeah.
Well, the air, there's lots to be allergic to in the air. Don't take that back. Or even more acceptably, not acceptably, but more conventionally serious diseases. How can we guide people in navigating these waters for themselves a little bit? And then also in finding that physician who's going to hear them, support them, not necessarily say, you're kind of looking for that parent that allows you to explore, is there to support you and kind of help you to brush yourself off when you fall over, but is going and is going to bring some wisdom to the table without taking away all of your kind of ownership over your own.
So some basics that I do with all patients is that, you want to try as much as possible to either reframe a threat that is in your life, or to remove yourself from that threat, full stop, end of story. And it could be obviously abusive relationship, or stop drinking that wine, Olivia. Stop drinking so much, or whatever it may be. So I think we all kind of know where we can improve. And we just have to start realizing how much it can actually move that needle. Okay. But it's also about flooding your body with these safety signals. And I call these safety signals now just like light, and I think that so many of us are trapped either in the future or in the past, or a combination of the two, and we're never actually in the present. And it is only really when you are in the present, dropping into a parasympathetic state, where you are giving yourself enough time, bandwidth, compassion, does your immune system actually start to go about the work of repairing. Because anxiety, fear, doubt, frustration, anger, all these things mean that you're in the future. So you're not here.
Or guilt and shame from
the past.
Guilt,
shame from the past. Exactly. And so those sorts of things are things that you can work on. I mean, we both know of liberate.health. So LIBER number 8.health, this precision emotional healing. Like that goes a long way to helping patients even identify emotions, identify some of those triggers, and then almost surgically help to remove thorns from the side, allowing the system to kind of breathe. Because so many people don't give those that emotional health and spiritual health the respect it deserves. We kind of leave that to the sort of last minute, I'm fine, look, give me the supplement first, and then maybe I'll think about doing some meditation, or I'll think about the fact that my father divorced my mother and walked out on us when I was 6. I'm sure that has got nothing to do with it. But if you're in a very, very sick position, you want to be leveraging everything that you can, surely, right?
And this is the low-hanging fruit.
This is low-hanging fruit. Yeah, absolutely. Right. The other safety signaling that I talk to patients about is very circadian biology driven. So it's if we understand how the brain is divvied up essentially into, your emotional brain, your prefrontal cortex, and then your more ancient brain, which is your cerebellum and brainstem. And you realize that in times where the nervous system and the immune system are afraid, it actually reverts back to ancient programs. Then you need to speak an ancient language. And that ancient language is getting up with the sun, daylight anchoring, having regular meals, having that community, getting into that rhythm. And when I say rhythm, in this case, I do mean drums or chanting or, meditation, song, all these things which our ancestors knew about and would practice regularly, which we obviously don't. Instead, we're sat on our bums all day, and then we watch our phone, then our laptop, then our phone, then our laptop, then our TV.
Yeah.
So,
We're always outside of ourselves.
right.
Yeah.
So, start looking at it from that circadian biology perspective. Wide open spaces. Why? Because when you're in a wide open space with your chin up, your chest out, your palms exposed, you are not afraid of being seen by an apex from the hills around you because you are apex. The fact that you can move your head and survey the horizon, and you can move your eyes left and right, lets your nervous system know that you can survey for threats, and it calms down just because you can do that, as opposed to just looking in one spot for hours on end. And your nervous system, the ancient brain, is kind of going, you haven't checked for danger for a while. Hello, you haven't checked.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Yeah. What's behind us? You haven't looked back there in a while.
Yeah.
So it's interesting what you say, this whole presence thing, because it really brings home the value of those tools like breath work,
Yes.
like meditation,
Yeah.
and even for the people who can't access those things, some of that technology that is now available to us, those little devices you clip on that you wear that buzz
Yeah.
and vibrate and do all the things. And we talk about, vagal nerve stimulation and this and that. But I wonder how much of it is just that sensation that brings you into the present space.
Right. So all
Right.
those devices, I mean, like the vibrating one, Sensate, Apollo Neuro, exactly that. It brings you back into the present. There is another device that I've been playing around with called Sensei, SENS.
Sense.ai.
.ai. And not only does it get you back into the present, and it has this gamified AI driven way of engaging you, but it actually has neurofeed EEG sensors. So the system is a closed loop system, and it actually challenges you in a way that's appropriate for you. So you're absolutely right. We have all these tools available to us, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is probably some choice paralysis, maybe, because there's so much great stuff out there.
Well, I think, and I tell people, I've got the Mendy over here where it's an EEG thing, and you stare at a ball on a screen and you try to
Move
lift
it.
it. And I'm like, what am I, a telepath all of a sudden? And I mean, I love it and I hate it and I hate it and I love it because, you have to stay positive. And if you stay positive, the ball's going to keep rising. And as soon as you're like, oh crap, I missed it, then poof, it drops. And you're like, shit. Anyway, but I think that what I tell people always around the technology is what resonates for you.
Yes. What sings to
right?
you? Mm-hmm.
What calls you? What do you think is, and sometimes, I mean, a lot of these devices give you 30 days to try them out. And if it really doesn't do anything, you can send it back. But I do think that if you have the right intention and understanding of what it is it can do for you, right? Because again, it is doing for you, but really you're opening the door to allow it to do it for you.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is just, it's open the door so you can step through yourself, right?
Yeah,
the very act that you put on a sensei, for example, that's autonomy, right? That's you taking control. And I think that there is so much that patients can do for themselves. And when they start looking at their symptoms as, what is the body trying to tell me? How is it trying to adapt? What does it think it's adapting to? Those are very important questions, because you'll start to get a little bit more insight into your health. and about finding the right practitioner. Well, I think when you see your practitioner or find a practitioner who is just willing to be a partner or a guide rather than didactic, you're already kind of winning a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, just find a practitioner who's willing to say, I don't know, and I'll look that up.
Yeah.
Winning.
Or let's look that up. Or, oh, what did you find?
Yeah,
okay, cool.
exactly.
Let's
Winning.
check that out.
That's right.
Yeah. Winning. I love it. Well, you mentioned Liberate.health, and actually the first podcast this year was an interview with them.
Oh,
with Raj
fantastic.
from Liberate.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you now work with them. So, which I don't think when I recorded with him, you were necessarily on board. So I do think that this area of healthcare is only going to grow, so that as we because I think what's happening, people are starting to talk about cell danger response, where the cells are
Robert
in this,
Navio.
right? And so that's scary. Like if your cells are afraid, like, okay, well, how are we going to convince them? Like I can, and so, but getting out of that little micro view and pulling back and understanding that this, the spirit, you have so much more agency over what's happening at a cellular level in your body. Is I think, hopefully where we're going with this. And
I feel like we're kind of coming, doing full circle with Bruce Lipton's work in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
The biology of belief and all that. I mean, that work was seminal, and we need to go back to those kind of very basic principles that, where you focus your energy is where your energies will flow, and, how you think affects your physiology. And, look at all this evidence for that in the literature. People need to start especially doctors need to start taking that more seriously.
100%. Look at the 97-year-old who's been smoking like a chimney since they were 16.
Exactly.
Like against all odds, right? Eating junk. Somebody was just telling me about a grandparent who's like a heavy has been smoking since they were a kid and eats junk and is kind of crusty, but kicking, like crushing it right now. Just like, there's got to be something we can learn from that. I don't know that we all want to be smoking like a chimney and eating crap and being crusty, but we should be asking some questions.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's it. Curiosity. Back to the curiosity thing, Nat. I love it.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Lesslar, where do people find you? How do they follow you? How do they follow your work? Which I think, is just so fascinating. And I know you've got your hand in a bunch of different projects.
Yeah. Well, I think the easiest place is Instagram, LinkedIn, and all those handles are at Dr. Olivia Lesslar. My website itself is www.drolivialesslar.com.
Beautiful.
I wish I was a little bit more active on social media, and I will endeavor to be so in 2024. But, a lot of the time, I think that I am just so inspired by people like you, for example, all these people who are asking questions. Just the curiosity in and of itself is inspiring to me to keep asking questions too. And the more questions we ask, the more answers we'll hopefully have, and the better off patients will be. So, thank you, Matt.
Oh, God. Thank you for the work you do. I find you incredibly inspiring. So I'm so happy that our paths crossed, and I can't wait till they cross again. So thank you for taking the time tonight. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks, Nat.